organized by TEDU, the Trade and Development Unit of the University of the West Indies. And this evening's forum will focus on Tobago's labor market realities and the Forex earning potential. And as I said, this is hosted by TEDU. Our today will be Dr. James is a born Tobagonian who lives in Tobago. He is an economist by training, a graduate of UWI St. Augustine and the New School of Social Research in New York. He has served as senior policy advisor to UNDP and to WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. He has prepared a number of reports on these and related matters, on intellectual property matters in the region. And he has also designed a manual for public expenditure reviews for countries of our region for the UN ECLAC. He recently published a book, Competing for Development, Perspectives on Self-Sustaining Growth for Caribbean Economies. Dr. James has consistently and persistently in his various publications argued that the main development problem of the Caribbean is that the domestic capital sector is too small. Dr. Vanus James will be our main speaker this evening, as I mentioned, and we have two eminent speakers to follow. As I have also mentioned, the focus of this evening's forum, hosted by TEDU, the Trade and Development Unit of UE, ably led by Professor Roger Hussein, is Tobago's labor market realities and Forex earning potential. I now ask Dr. Vanus James to present and to begin this evening's discussion. His focus has long been the pathway to economic development in Tobago. My name is Bo Tiwari, and I'll be chairing the proceedings this evening. So over to you, Vanus.
Let me defer to Roger. Bo, thanks for the introduction and all, but Roger is in the airport and rushing to catch his flight and asked to present first so that just in case he has to run. So I would defer to him and allow him to present first. What do you think?
Go first? Will you go first?
Okay, right. So Dr. Tiwari, is it okay if I go ahead?
Yeah, would you like me to introduce you or do it after?
No. I would just, I will skip that, if that's okay with you.
You'll skip the introduction?
Yes.
All right, okay, go ahead.
So everyone, good evening. Professor James, thanks for accommodating me. My flight to Aruba got delayed, and so I'm in a sticky situation. But the show has to go on, so I'm trying to do it from where I am sitting. Whenever I speak with Professor James, I know what memories come to me. He was my lecturer, and he drilled us in microeconomic theory. He was very tough, but you know, if you all see me make any mistakes, it's mainly due to him. In terms of mentorship and some of the good things that I do, it's also good due to people like him. So having said that, I will be very brief. You know, the situation we have and the problem we have in Trinidad and Tobago as a collectivity is, by and large, we have a severe foreign exchange shortage.
Professor, can you put this on presentation mode, please?
Yes, sorry. And what that means is that we need to redesign our substantive production base in favor of more tradable goods away from non-tradable goods. So in basic economics, start from a point such as E to a point such as F. Now, I don't intend to belabor any point because I don't think there's anybody in the world that knows the Tobago sub-economy as well as Professor James. So people like me would give our comments, but I really defer to him for the detail. So this is simply an overview of the real value added in tourism in the Tobago subsector based on some data I got from the policymakers there. And you could see it, certainly after 2020, there is a gradual increase, even superseding what we saw before 2019. Real output per worker, though, when I calculated it, is on the decline, and that's not something that we want to see. So policymakers in Tobago would have to really put some solid effort in my opinion, to reverse these trends. When I look at the labor force participation, when I look at the output per worker, it didn't only decline in the overall Tobago sub-economy, it specifically declined in the manufacturing sector, and the biggest employer, the services sector. Petroleum employment is very, very trivial, and therefore, although you see an increase there, it's elementary, and agricultural output in Tobago is very elementary. So although you see an increase there, it was really swamped by the negative 18.7 sector. Now, I looked at the relationship between real economic growth and the labor force participation rate in Tobago, and there's no really strong predefined relationship, but the general theory will tell us that as the labor force participation rate increases in our country, the economic growth performance and output level could improve. In terms of the change in the labor force participation rate between Tobago and other segments of the economy, interestingly, Tobago increased, while most of the other subcomponents of the Trinidad and Tobago economy from a geographic perspective declined. And here I show a comparison of the labor force participation rate in Tobago as compared to all Trinidad and Tobago, and it's substantially high. And the obvious question is why? So this brings me back to this first graph here. And the question I want to leave you all with is what I call the substantive question. How can we work with the labor force in Tobago in a manner and form that pushes the economy away from E towards F, so that all hands are pulling in the same direction? That is the direction of earning more foreign exchange. So having said that, I say thank you. I say thank you, everyone, and I would field questions later on.
Okay, thank you very much, Roger. It's a succinct presentation, but very, very clear, having to do with labor participation, labor productivity, and the focus on tradables rather than non-tradables in order to win foreign exchange, and with a targeted focus on the labor market in Tobago. I want to introduce Professor Hussain at this point. That is to say, to give you a context of who he is. He is a professor of economics, director of TEDU, the Trade and Development Unit of UE, which initiated this series and has been managing and running it for about 3 years now. He is a UWI and University of Cambridge economist who has distinguished himself in the region as an economist of note. Professor Hussain's knowledge, competence, and insight has been drawn upon by many governments of the region and several multilateral leaders. The Shaw Foundation, which he has helped to create and which he has provided leadership for, is a major intervention in the home and community self-sufficiency in food movement. This NGO, Shaw Foundation, is led by Rebecca Gookool, whom you would have seen on the program, and who is with us. Professor Hussain is a thought leader on economic matters in this country and region, who continues to teach students, develop them as researchers, and has continued to do research and to write a tremendous number of articles and nearly a dozen books on subjects of significant relevance and value to the region. And as you see, Professor Hussain doesn't talk more than he has to. He simply said what he had to. He made one serious but integrated point, and he said he would deal with the questions later. I introduced our lead speaker earlier, Dr. Vanas James, and I would just ask him now if he will proceed to make his presentation and intervention.
I will. Let me begin by saying that there is a little bit of current context for what I have to say. Quite apart from what is happening in Tobago, what's happening on the national landscape. And that is that we are seeing growing signs of rising pressure on the national import cover. Banks are tightening and enforcing tighter limits of access to foreign exchange. And that's a warning sign that the next downward shock in oil prices would be would kind of introduce a veritable disaster in our national economy.
Okay, speak into the microphone a little bit, Vanas, please.
Yes, all right. Is that better?
Make your sound better. We're seeing you, but we make your sound better. Yeah.
Let me see if I can do anything on the sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about that? Is that clearer?
Yeah, that's a little better.
Clearer. All right. My comments will be model-based. After some 47 years or so, we've been able to build a model of the development path of the national economy, an effort we started back in 1977 with Lloyd Best, and we couldn't get the work done. And we've managed to, we have data, we have methods, we have software, and so on. And so now we're able to do what was required. Since then, we have data from 1970 to 2022. And as you can imagine, much of what I have done is heavily informed by the works of both Arthur Lewis and Lloyd Best. And the essential principle, which is what I build on, is that we have an economy that is capital deficient. That's one of the things we can ask Roger about. The data that we have on the Tobago economy is that and on the national economy, is that we have a large pool of undereducated workers, and the modeling that we've done demonstrates clearly that, as Lloyd Best anticipated and as Lewis anticipated, the economy is externally propelled, but it has a civilization building component that can be the focus of our efforts to rescue ourselves from repeated foreign exchange access crisis. The earnings potential of Tobago has to be the foreign exchange earnings potential and the general economic earnings income creating potential of Tobago must be understood in the context of a national effort to develop, the effort to grow through controlled measures, sound policies, if you like, the development core of the national economy. And that means growing 4 critical variables: capital per worker, which is your capacity building initiative; exports per worker; the national savings rate, long identified by Lewis as a critical variable, and that savings mainly from profits; and productivity in the civilization building sector, what Best called the residential sector back in 1968. That's a sector in which we produce capital. That's a sector in which we do the bulk of our innovation, whether we're talking about music or in high scholarship. That's the sector in which we build our communities. That's located mainly in our communities. It's our communities that invented that sector. And when you look at the evidence and you find measures of it, you will find that it is one of the 3 development drivers at the core of the development pathway of an economy like Trinidad and Tobago. And I might say the same is true for Jamaica and, of course, for the subcomponents of the national economy like Tobago. We use estimates for Jamaica. We ran models for Jamaica as well as for Trinidad and Tobago. And with that set of outputs, we've shown that all of these 4 components, if shocked simultaneously, controlled to grow at the rate you want them to grow at simultaneously, you would get a particular kind of result that you can't get from almost any other shock. Labor productivity would grow, the rate of profit would grow, GDP per capita would grow, and inflation would be constrained, or at least, maybe better still, you'd be able to get an acceptable trend decline in the domestic price level. So no other kind of shock that I have experimented with in the modeling delivers that kind of simultaneous progress in all of the core indicators of the pathway of development for the country. Now, among the critical forces that you have to control, calibrate properly in order to, and calibrate by an appropriate policymaking process as well, in order to achieve any desired shock to those 4 variables, right? The critical forces that you have to shock and calibrate and manage are these. One of them is the scale and targeting of production of exportable capital. So we're not just talking about exports, like we've traditionally talked about exports of oil and gas and exports of sugar and what have you. The evidence we now have after 53 years of observation is that you have to be talking about production and export of capital. Capital means goods or services that you produce and use or sell to the world to use to make other things. Produce means of production, as the Marxists used to say. That's the essential meaning of capital in economics. And we have to expand the scale and the targeting of exportable capital. And what we're talking about in particular for Trinidad and Tobago, and much of the Caribbean, really, including Cuba, is knowledge production and the production of education services and related professional services. Let me emphasize again and again, for export, and you extract, of course, local inputs from that. But the export targeting is in a kind of way a quality control mechanism that allows the society to extract high quality if it succeeds in collaborating with the world to produce exportable capital of the kind that I'm talking about. So knowledge production and education services and related professional services would be one. Healthcare, that would be another kind of exportable capital service. The creative industries, including sports, you're talking about your music and all of those things that we brand as creative because they generate particular forms of intellectual property. Copyright is the one that I've spent my career studying most. The financial services, that's what Cayman and Bermuda and those islands and countries have focused on. The Bahamas is heading there and earning significant returns from focusing on the financial services. I think if we were to go back and listen to Patrick Manning, we would think that we have lost a step and an opportunity to make a foray into the financial services. But in any case, they count as capital services. And the housing stock that is configured to support exports of all of those that I mentioned there on a tourism platform, the tourism links in their value chains, so to say, what I like to describe as industrialized tourism, the housing stock that supports that. The housing stock that supports that, I might remind you, you'll best understand if you take a look at the kind of tourism housing stock that you have in a place like the Cayman or in Bermuda, where instead of 5-star, $500 room per night hotels, you're talking about 20-room boutique type facilities that could bring professionals into the space and host them for 6 months at $150, $200 US a night rather than $500 and $600 US a night. That sort of stuff is what I'm talking about. Housing stock configured to support production and export of the capital services on a tourism platform, which of course we're equipped to do in all, pretty much all of the Caribbean islands, including especially Tobago, of course. The second thing you have to pay a lot of attention to as a critical underlying force is foreign capital inflows combined with supportive government spending and service production into the capital production activities. So this is a little different from what we've been doing with oil and gas. And what we've been doing generally across the region is to bring foreign capital on its terms, like what Lewis described in his 1954 classic piece. You have a natural resource that could make high profits, and so the foreigners would be naturally interested in that. But I am talking about steering the foreigners on terms that you could see used, for example, by an economy like Malta, bringing them into the sectors you want them to come into, to give you assistance to produce exportable capital. And when you combine them with foreign capital inflows, with supportive government spending in that way, one of the things you get out of all of that is a key form of institutional upgrade, institutional progress. The third thing you have to pay a lot of attention to if you want to expand your exports per worker and facilitate foreign capital inflows, which together combine to give you the bulk of your foreign exchange inflows, would be supportive credit flows at suitable, let me just say summarily, development rates to support production of the capital services for export. And then there is something that you will extract from a careful understanding of what Lewis was saying, and a lot of what Lloydis was saying too, which is that if you want to prevent the market wage from rising too fast to snuff out the profits on which you will save appropriately and adequately, then you have to go the social wage rather than the market wage. You have to do things that give social benefits, good governance, related services, and all of that, that raise the social benefits people extract from economy-wide social support systems, social safety net systems, and other things like those, that would allow people not to be under the kinds of pressures they would normally be under to push for market wage increases. If you have a reasonably well-calibrated program of social wage development and increase, then the pressures on the market wage that businesses, entrepreneurs face in the open market, labor market, would be a little bit moderated. So those are the 4 key things you have to focus on if you want to be able to drive the process of policy making adequately and achieve the kinds of development shocks that you want to push the economy along an appropriate development path, in which exports would be a critical element. Of course, as I said, exports per worker would grow, and it would grow along with the foreign capital inflows, and the consequence of that would be you would create a rising ratio of your exports to your imports. Remember, external propulsion means high degrees of import dependence. Imports drive your exports more than capital production drives your exports, for example. That would be a key manifestation of that. Well, all of that will tend to change if you achieve the production of capital for export of the kind that I'm talking about. Now, a critical element of the capital production process that you have to keep an eye on, it was revealed clearly by the ILO, especially in the 2012 ISCO 08 upgrade, which is that you really have to put a lot of attention to growing the knowledge and skills of workers, with particular relevance to the capacity to produce knowledge that push the boundaries of current knowledge and help entrepreneurs and even government-owned enterprises and so on to bring to market new solutions to problems that markets throw up locally and internationally. And we know we can calculate the rates of change needed to deliver specific goals and targets for the growth of the core and therefore growth of the wider set of development indicators. However, when you look at the way you can model the economy to fit the facts as accurately as we have done, what you would find is that you have a huge amount of interdependence in the economy, mirroring in a certain kind of sense what Leon Teeth laid out in his classic input-output works. And when you have variables like the ones I've described, being highly interdependent with your GDP per capita and your productivity, your savings rate, your exports per worker, your productivity growth in your civilization building sector and so on, where your profit rate, when these are highly interdependent, it is virtually impossible for any one set of people, any cabinet, any public service, any small team, to on its own know exactly what kind of calibration has to be achieved in order to, and what kind of some policies must come out of that, you know, what kind of some development policies must come out of that the calibration process. If they are making targets and setting goals and so on, unlimited information, they're not going to get it right. You will need a full information system of decision making, a full information governance arrangement, what the UN likes to call joint decision making system. That's designed at all levels of government, and maybe pervasive in the system as a whole, where the habits of information sharing are cultivated, but especially in the governance framework, to bring all stakeholders into the process of determining what is to be done, by whom, when, with what collective, national and international support, and so on. So to deliver the kinds of shocks that are needed to put the economy on a development path overall, when all the 8 variables I characterized, they are moving in the way you want them to move, the first 7 of them, so to say, pushing upwards, and the price level moving downwards or staying stationary. To get that, you're going to need a full information system in which all the stakeholders are sitting around the table in some adequate sense and making clear decisions about what is to be done to push development and therefore to grow exports per worker, driven as appropriate by foreign capital inflows that are targeting capital production and Forex. Now, what you have to note here is that most or all of the capital production and the related innovation initiatives in the evidence that we have on both the Jamaican economy and the Trinidad and Tobago economy, most of those things take place in the civilization building residential sector, which we have traditionally discriminated against by the culture of government and politics that we've inherited and cultivated. And so Bear with me 1 second there. Let me just get this phone out of the way. Sorry. And so the historically closed limited information decision-making systems that we have been operating are major barriers to the achievement of development in the sense that I'm talking about it, and a major set of barriers to growing the capacity to exploit the foreign exchange creating potential of the economy, including that of Tobago. Now, partly because of its current state of underdevelopment, if Tobago is properly reorganized, it can be instrumental in getting all of the core development initiatives in place that I described. It has a rich potential for value added through tourism along its industrial value chains. It has a particularly great level of attractiveness as a locus of foreign entrepreneurs, the entry of foreign entrepreneurs and their workers, because of its status as the safest and most family-friendly part of the country. And you could boost that as part of national policy if you're careful about the way it's done. It has a natural locus of community-owned enterprise. Tobago is organized around 42 communities, village communities, tightly organized, defined, local loyalties, and so on, that can lead the development of successful community-owned businesses. And bear in mind that community-owned businesses is one of the underutilized potential of the whole country. I always tell my colleagues, if you pay attention to what Laventille could have achieved, had it had an empowered community to drive its innovations in PAN, that gives you a sense of what community-owned enterprise could deliver to the country. That's a whole level of development potential we have left under exploited, and it is part of the long historical discrimination against our own efforts at civilization building. That's what colonialism writ large really is all about, discrimination against yourself. Its governance arrangements, the Tobago governance arrangements, can be transformed pretty quickly into full information decision-making systems in a very short time, so to say. And that's especially because of those community structures that I'm talking about. But it would take skillful and insightful political initiatives on the part of the population. I'm not talking so much about the government as much as about the population, to get all of this kind of stuff in place for us to exploit the potential for Tobago to contribute to the production of foreign exchange, and for Tobago to end 140 years of direct dependence for almost 85% of its sustenance, direct dependence on the Trinidad economy. Never mind all the talk you get in Tobago where I live about how Trinidad feels and Trinidad doesn't feel about Tobago and all of that. This is an economy that is heavily dependent on transfers, not from the government, from the Trinidad economy. And to end all of that, you have to do the things that I have set out here to exploit its potential to contribute to foreign exchange. You have to do all the things that I have set out here as required for the national economy to develop. You have to do them in Tobago as a matter of urgency, and you can. So let me end my comments on that note. I think I've used up my 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Banos, Dr. James, for your contribution. They're very insightful, very thoughtful, leaning on some of us. Sorry? Hello? Hello?
Dr. Tiwari, go ahead.
Okay, I thought something happened there, sorry. leaning somewhat on the early work of Best and Lewis, but focusing directly on the challenges that we face now for Forex nationally. In your early part of your presentation, you talked about the signals of pressure on the import cover for the entire country as indicating, based on behavior by the banks, that something was going wrong. And you focused on the labor market in Tobago, and you focused on the shortage of capital. You talked about comparisons with places like Bermuda and Cayman Islands to talk about how we might turn around some of these industries to make them capital intensive in terms of export potential. And you close by talking about Tobago basically reducing its dependence on the Trinidad government and becoming a productive sector that could be self-sustaining. So thank you very much for that input. And we go on now to our third speaker for the evening. He is Dr. Arthur Potts. He's a Tobagonian also. He is a marine resources management specialist or professional. He serves as associate professor and program leader of the Marine Sciences Unit at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, its Chaguaramas campus. And his specific interests are on sustainable fisheries management. And this is focused not just on Trinidad and Tobago, but the Caribbean. Sustainable aquaculture development for Tobago, Trinidad and Tobago and the region. The importance of fishing and associated livelihoods to the coastal fishing sector. Climate change and its impacts on local and Caribbean fisheries and coastal fisheries environment. Dr. Potts, I want to welcome you to the KEDU series and to thank you for agreeing to contribute, and we look forward to your contribution.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor. Former minister, of course. And thanks very much to the forum for inviting me. It's my first session with you guys. And I really enjoyed the first two presentations. Very economic stuff, but still within my ability to understand. This evening, let me just upload my stuff here. This evening, I will try to say a few things about the fishing sector. Initially, I just want to start off by saying that globally, fish consumption has increased. Well, for whatever reason, some persons recognize that there's better health benefit coming from fish maybe and seafood. So lots of persons moving in that direction. And at the same time, there's concern about stocks and the sustainability of stocks. So there's a critical condition globally where stocks are concerned. Well, within the last 30 years, the information that we have is that there has been an increase in capture fisheries globally, and capture fisheries refer to literally humans hunting fish that is already out there in the sea or in the rivers or the lakes, which is what we normally did before we got into treating with aquaculture, which is literally the agriculture of marine animals and marine plants. And what we have noticed is that literally from the late 1990s, early 2000s, there has been a real increase of some 527% of aquaculture production, to the extent that fish which is produced annually at about 90 million metric tons worldwide, not from the capture fisheries source, now amounts to almost 180 million metric tons, doubled because of aquaculture production. As a result, we have recognized worldwide a 122% rise in fish consumption. All this is just to say that fish is considered literally an important food source. World capture fisheries, just looking at this graph, literally the brown, up to the brown line shows where capture fisheries is, that fish caught literally using nets and lines and so on. And above that, the two shades of blue refer to the aquaculture production. So you can see literally that aquaculture is almost as much as capture fisheries as at 2018. All right, so, and that's literally up to 180 million metric tons of fish that is produced annually, globally. Regionally, we are from a very small region, and we don't even produce annually. We talking CARICOM, we don't produce 1 million metric tons of fish. We literally produce just a few tons of fish, right? Not more than 180 metric tons produced CARICOM-wide. Might look like a lot of fish when you go down to the wharf or down to the ports in Trinidad. So these fellas catching a lot of fish. It is a lot of fish, but when you think about it globally, we are very minuscule. Notwithstanding that, that is very important for Trinidad and Tobago and the CARICOM. As you can see, this top line is the CARICOM line, which shows that CARICOM-wide, we're collecting just a little under 180 metric tons. And we have Antigua, Barbuda. Trinidad and Tobago is this brown line down here, somewhere about 14 to 18 metric tons annually. Okay. We have a consumption of 10 to 35 kilograms per capita in the CARICOM. We have about 64,000 persons working, 180,000 indirectly. So, and about $291 million US is made annually according to the 2012 figure, and was up a little bit by 2000. Regionally, just looking at what is called in terms of CARICOM imports, US $million. Between 2010 and 2013, we imported almost 65 million US dollars worth of fish products in Jamaica. Trinidad and Tobago, we import as much as 45 or 47 million US dollars worth of fish. In terms of aquaculture, Trinidad and Tobago has not been producing much in terms of aquaculture. Belize has been the leader in the Caribbean where that is concerned, and Jamaica. So in terms of an area where we could probably look at is aquaculture. We have some small aquaculture business going on. People doing tank aquaculture of tilapia for food and so on, and of course ornamental fish for export, but nothing of any major thing as yet. In terms of Trinidad and Tobago, well, we in Trinidad and Tobago, we involved in 4 different types of fishery. And you can see that from the different maps. This map A on the top left here, map A on the top left shows what in these blue areas where the trawl fishery takes place, soft bottom demersals. In B, you saw all these are fish potting areas, and here between hard bottom demersals. In terms of C, we have the coastal pelagic fishery with gill nets. And if you look at Tobago, this is the first time Tobago is really featuring the whole of Tobago at the Caribbean coast, gill net, and that's literally for the flying fish fishery, and to some extent the associated species. Of course, the D, coastal pelagic fishery, we're talking about catching those coastal pelagics like dolphin fish, kingfish, wahoo, carite in Trinidad, and so on. And of course, in E, this is beach scenes, use of beach scenes. So that's the kind of fishery that we're involved with, 4 or 5 different types of fishery nationally. It is important to note that these are some of the major species that we catch in Trinidad the Spanish mackerel, the kingfish, the cavali, the shark, for the flying fish, shrimp, croaker, and so on, snappers, right? And this account for less than, capture fisheries account for less than 0.45% of our national GDP. However, it supports over 40,000 persons directly or indirectly in terms of employment and so on. And the average landing, as I said earlier, annually is about 15,000 tons. And we have about 1,640 vessels, mainly pirogues involved in the fleet, and rely heavily in Trinidad and Tobago on imported fish for our fisheries consumption. We normally don't produce enough fish to satisfy our country. And of course, anything that we eat, sardines and saltfish and pink salmon and all these things, these are all imported stuff. We rely heavily on that imported thing. And fisheries in general in the country is generally poorly regulated. These colors here, of course, talk about the particular species, the status in terms of being overfished or overexploited. The darker the colors, like red is more overexploited and overfished. The orange is sort of like overexploited and coming closer to being fully fished. And of course, yellow, only when you get down to the lighter colors and the greens, you're underexploited and so on. And you realize which species, the king mackerel, for instance, the kingfish is considered overexploited, and the carrot and so on. The cavali is fine, and the flying fish is fine. Shrimp is fine, of course. Not all the shrimp, but some of the shrimp species. In terms of capture fisheries and aquaculture in Trinidad and Tobago, as I said, we don't do too much. In terms of aquaculture, our aquaculture is generally low. We don't do much more than about 20-something metric tons. And same thing with the capture fisheries in general. We don't catch too much fish in Trinidad and Tobago, right? The data, of course, in Trinidad and Tobago is very much skewed to what is happening in Trinidad, with very little information telling you clearly what is happening to Tobago's landings. As a result, not very much good data is available in Tobago. Tobago has a Department of Marine Resources and Fisheries that has had a data collection team for the longest while. They work literally Monday to Friday, not very much on holidays, mainly during the working hours and not really on weekends. And so the data they collect sometimes is not of the best value to provide the kind of guidance that is required. So I'll tell you that within recent times, UDT has been involved with some work with Shell to try to help Tobago improve that stuff. The actual work has not been completed, but there are a number of recommendations that may come out of that may help improve the situation in terms of data collection in Tobago. Right? It's important to note that per capita consumption in Trinidad and Tobago is 25.9 grams. People do consume fish, and it is mainly, fish that is caught is mainly sold on the domestic market. Not much fish from Trinidad and Tobago is exported, right? Of course, you know a little bit about Tobago's geography already, how big it is, and only 120 kilometers of coastline. 60,000 persons live on it. 1,800 persons fully involved in the fishing industry in Tobago. And Tobago has about 33 landing sites, 19 of which are on the Caribbean side and 14 on the Atlantic side. And these are the landing sites in Tobago. We have Charlottesville, we have Manawar Bay, one of the major areas on Speyside. And coming down, we have Bloody Bay, Palatuvia, Castara, very important fish landing areas. King Peter's Bay, only one boat operate from there. Culloden, smaller amounts. Kilometer, an important landing site. And so is Mount Irvin, Buku, and Milford Pigeon Point area. Scarborough, another important one. Roxborough is also a generally good area for landing, and Belgarden. Most of the others on the Atlantic side, you have small quantum of fishermen operating in these areas. All right, very important to note where these landing sites. The vessels that they utilize in Tobago are a mix. There's a mixed bag of vessels. You have what we consider multi-purpose vessels, but not large, not a large. One time we had about 10 of them operating in Tobago, but within recent times the number has dropped down to about 6 of them, 10 to 23 meters long, and they literally could spend up to 15 days at sea with 5 persons aboard, and they get involved with the same flying fish and associated species fishery, and they can be part of the recommendations that we could look at for future in terms of more persons moving away from small vessels to larger vessels to get more involved with the fishery in terms of labor and being able to make a living out of it, because we recognize that notwithstanding the fact that oil and gas is the major thing in the country, in Tobago, in addition to tourism, this fishing industry does have a place. All right, there are about 684 vessels registered in Tobago that are already 7 to 9 meter powered or outboard powered, mainly 2-stroke 45 to 75 horsepower engines that are involved in the fishery, about 684 of them. And of course, these pirogues are mainly fiberglass type, and they are made by Boeing and other companies in Trinidad. No company in Trinidad works on building these kinds of vessels. There are a couple of Tobagonians who build wooden boats, but that wooden boat thing that we used to call the bomb boat has been removed from the industry. Literally 90-something% of the boats utilized are of this fiberglass nature, and it is more durable, and of course, much of the persons involved in the fishery now own one of those things. But the fishermen are involved in long line and multi-purpose fishery, banking. They use fads, a la vive, fish pots, trolling, and so on, palang, different types of methods. And the operations are, as I said, mainly from Pigeon Point to Charlottesville on that Caribbean coast, and a few major areas on the Atlantic side. And in both islands, the fishing methods are quite the same methods I mentioned just now. And of course, we involve a lot in coastal pelagic and substrate fishery and demersal fisheries as well. And that talks about catching demersally the snappers and the lobsters and groupers and so on. And of course, the pelagics, we talk about the flying fish and the dolphin fish, the wahoo, kingfish, and sharks and tunas and so on. Those are the major species that are targeted. And fish is sold literally in communities throughout the island. When the men, we have 1 or 2 persons who are middlemen who come and collect fish and sometimes deliver ice, and they will then do some fish processing. So there's some value-added work done to the fish, and sometimes and it's sold in the supermarkets and the hotel industry in Tobago. That is an important bit of thing. Processors, not many processors are on the island at this time. One time there was up to 10 processors. I think we're down to about 3 processors right now. Not much is happening in terms of export. So another place for potential for improvement in terms of people getting involved in the fishing industry itself and being able to make a living and improve their livelihood. Economically, a number of species are important, and we'll get to them quickly. So in Tobago, we look at a local fishing kind of enterprise and a foreign fishing where they deal with boats mainly coming from Barbados. And much times on TV, you'd see the president of the All Tobago Fisher Folk, Mr. Douglas, talking about issues that he faced with those fishers and calling on government to do things. But lots of talk about compensation and so on, which to them I'm sure is important once they lose fishing time based on different activities of seismic and so on. So they'll talk about that. So some 2,500 tons of fish was landed in Tobago in 2010, and 71% of that came from subsistence, and of course the small boat fishery. Most of the fish coming from those small boats, and not much from the big boats. As I said, not very much big boats are involved in fishing. The issue, of course, in Trinidad and Tobago, I said oil and gas is a big thing. Only 15% of the national GDP could be considered from anything else or where agriculture falls, and only 0.1% of that national GDP is fisheries. Of course, we don't get more than about $161.7 million worth of fish imported every year, on average, sorry, which is a large number, and $83 million, $83 million according to we export, sorry, at 83 million. So we import much more fish than we export in Trinidad and Tobago. So there is indeed room for improvement in terms of what can be done with the fishery and what can be caught and sold that could probably help cut down on that deficit. Right? Tobago is a tourism-based economy. Fishing plays a large role on that island, of course. Right, 2.8% of the Tobagonians are fisher folk. Nationally, as I pointed out, some 10,000 persons are involved in the fishery directly, 50,000 persons indirectly, right? 4,000 registered fishermen. And on the other hand, in Tobago, the numbers are smaller. And of course, it leads us to this portion here where I want to talk a little bit about what has been happening within recent times. As I said, the Tobago, the data situation is very poor, and we have launched within recent time a bit of a research to try to determine three major things. What is happening on the landing sites in Tobago in terms of fish being caught, and who goes to sea, who are the persons involved, the demographics that is, and what kind of fish they're catching and what quantum, what species. We also want to understand what is happening to the fish after it leaves the fisherman at the ports in terms of the value chain. Where does the fish go if the value is added all the way to the consumption level at the plate? We try to have a value chain part of the study done, and also a third part of the study, we work on looking at what is happening with the livelihoods, the livelihood of fisher folk, and if the fishing industry itself is providing for the fisherman's household and what it is providing, how much is being achieved in terms of livelihood. So that study is quickly ongoing. And at one point in the future, we'll come back to provide most of the data on that. But for the time being, just suffice it to say that the value of the fish, we had a preliminary look at some of the things last year when we were halfway through. And these are some of the species that are caught in Tobago. That dolphin fish, right, is the major species that is caught and brings in the highest amount we notice in terms of our estimates, some $5 million annually coming from that, and some $15 million we estimated at the time was the kind of income based on the data provided. Of course, a number of persons did not provide the best data or the accurate data, but based on the data provided, we recognize that this industry is not a little by the way small industry that can be ignored. But that fish is being caught, fish is being sold, money is being made by fishermen in Tobago, and that it must be seriously looked at in terms of an area in the Tobago economy from which persons can be involved as opposed to depending on CPEP and URP and so on, where they probably make $200 and something a day. When we recognize the kind of income that fishermen seem to be making, they're clearly, in addition to probably having those jobs as well and finishing those jobs by 7 or 8 o'clock in some of the cases, when they go to sea, they could easily make double that amount of money per day in the industry. There's clearly room here to look at this. So when we look at all the different species that are being caught in Tobago, the lowest landed was blue marlin, of course, that is usually caught in fishing tournaments and so on. But in terms of the dolphin fish, which is one of the major target species for human consumption, $4.6 million being made. In looking at some of the landing work that we did from April to 2023 to now, we realized that the weight of the species in pounds, we were bringing in literally some over 75,000 pounds in July last year, and some months in terms of the data collected, people are literally landing large quantum of fish on the island. So overall, we've seen some 80,000 pounds of fish being caught literally in Tobago. So the fishing industry does have somewhere to go. Of course, there are about, as we said, there were 600 and something registered boats, but about 300 and something tend to be average. The average of 300 and something involved in the fishery. And of course, we're coming out of the COVID, so we do not have, in our mind, total participation we're noticing. But on any month, we notice an average of some 150 plus of these boats was actually going to sea and engage in itself in the fishery. So against all that, it is important to note that although we see, of course, tourism maybe as the number one possibility for labor and for work in Tobago, the fishing industry has great potential. And it can be seriously looked at. Notwithstanding that, we must look at a number of the challenges that we were advised by the fisher folk mainly that they've been encountering and what we notice ourselves. Of course, there's competition from other fisheries sector, industrial people who actually from different countries, Venezuela and Barbados, that look in those waters. We have issues with habitat degradation. There's some issue with IUU fishing that we have to look at. Some concerns with overfishing, as I pointed out earlier, some of the species based on research have some issues that we must consider. And of course, there are a number of international conventions and that we are signatory to that we have to take note of. Of course, there's competition for space in the coastal area for housing and conservation efforts and tourism and recreation and so on. Big concern, especially in that Gookool, Mount Irving, Pigeon Point area where the Book Reef is. Of course, we have some concerns in terms of pollution, right? Some of the fisher folk talk about having theft where people literally steal their engines, and so there's more concern again for security. The crime matter in the country does not escape the fishing industry. Poor infrastructure in terms of landing sites and place to store engines and to do repairs on land and so on. There's some concerns about that. On encroachment, of course, by Barbados. The sargassum weed issue, a big issue in Tobago. Some of you might be following it in the news where sometimes, especially on the Atlantic side, large portions of the coastal area totally covered with sargassum seaweed to the extent that boats can't even be removed from their mooring spot to go to sea. We have a real concern about record keeping. A lot of the fishermen in Tobago are poor record keepers. As a result, lots of the data that we get from some of them come literally from memory and from literally their brain power. So there is need in that area to improve on that. Of course, there's a Department of Marine Resources and Fisheries with extension people. We have to probably see how we can do to assist and advise. Difficulty with accessing subsidies and grants and loans so that they can improve and expand in the fishery industry. That's an area that they complain about. And of course, lack of communication with important agencies and government divisions that they depend on to do the fishing industry. I know my time is probably fast approaching, but a few more minutes. I just want to talk quickly about challenges of the industry, oil and gas challenges, facilities, environmental and poor health. Of course, this oil and gas issue, if you look at this map right here, you see that there are a number of blocks off Tobago. These blocks off Tobago, we have a number of the oil and gas companies operating in the area. As a result, just like what's going on in Trinidad, South and Southeast, there are issues in terms of safety zones. The rigs, of course, act as fishery attraction devices. Fishermen try to get there. Sometimes they run into problems with the oil companies. Sometimes there's small leakages from the oil areas. that sometimes can affect the nursing ground and so on. And of course, they're concerned about major oil companies infringing on original fishing ground and so on. Fishermen are concerned about that. I did mention the issue about poor facilities. This is like one poor facility. You see roof missing, galvanized and so on. And so there's some concern about some of these that we need to be improving. I know the Tobago also Assembly been doing some work. Of course, the issue of theft I mentioned already. The issue about nursery grounds degrading or being overexploited. The mangroves in Tobago, especially with that oil leak within recent times, most of the mangrove on that Kilgwin lowlands area have been very much affected. Right on the other side, where we have the Book Reef complex, the mangrove there, most of the lands are butting the mangrove. The 12 plus hectares that are left have been is a reduced figure because the Mount Pleasant Credit Union that did own the land adjoining that, they did some expansion and claimed some more of the land for housing. So there are some concern, and these are nursery grounds for important species. So real concern there that need to be getting involved if you have to think about securing the whole fishing and fishing industry to ensure that people find jobs and are able to work in these environments. Talking about that barnacle. There are other concerns with seagrass beds and the coral reefs and so on that I wouldn't focus on here, but important. Of course, the important management issues, which could be solved literally, revamp the legislation. And of course, much more people need to be aware of what is happening in terms of compliance for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Some time ago, we issued a yellow card that will affect our exports and our markets. If people have to get involved in the fishery, they wouldn't want to just be selling fish locally, but they want to access export markets so that literally monies could be made and so on. Lots of incentives are important. All right. Of course, we have recommendations, a lot of recommendations that I will focus on because we have conflicts between oil and gas people and fisher folk. You've been hearing about a lot of those. We try to get those solved. Surveying activities, conflicts with those. And of course, we have to be concerned about stringent certificate environmental clearance when applications are made to ensure that there's serious protection of the fishery. The issue about environmental health, they have one better waste management in the area. Of course, they have the hotels, some of them literally dumping stuff in the area, which is of concern. And of course, we talk about the facilities upgrade already. And of course, some of these other recommendations. Overall, I just want to say that the Tobago fishing industry is alive. It could be well. A number of things can be done to improve on it because a number of young people are involved in the fishery and continue to want to get involved in the fishery. People may think about it as a simple industry, but when a man could invest in a boat that costs over $200,000 and engines that cost another $150,000 and nets and mendings and nets and tackling, that cost another $100,000, you're talking about an investment of almost $600,000. And if people are bringing in fish on a regular basis to the extent that they're making at least twice the amount per day that they could make an URP, and URP is about $260 per day, there is indeed room there for employment in the fishery. And of course, the market is still at a local one where people are providing fish mainly for the Tobago market at this point in time. More can be done to be expanded to access some of the Trinidad market and the regional market, and of course, the international market. So therefore, I am of the firm belief that the fishing industry is a great potential area for Tobago to help alleviate any concerns we have in terms of labor and anything to do with improving the livelihood of persons in Tobago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Arthur Potts, for a very, very comprehensive contribution this evening. We had three really excellent contribution. The first one by Professor Hussein, who had to leave us. And he basically made a link in keeping with the theme labor market realities and Forex earning potential. He made a link between the quality of the labor force and the need to have it focused in terms of productivity to Forex in Trinidad and Tobago generally. But he made the micro appeal in the context of the smaller Tobago economy. And then we had Vanus James, who, focusing on the same theme, talked about the level of what you might just say the worker capacity because of under-education on the one hand and productivity on the other. And he talked about the potential that was there in terms of knowledge and education, professional services, healthcare, and creative industries and sports, and what we might be able to do with that. And then Dr. Potts talked about the potential of the fishing industry. It was to some extent viable, but we were importing more fish than we were actually exporting. Although we did have the capacity for some level of self-sufficiency with the fishing industry. But clearly from his observations and his research, it was not as organized as it could be. It was rather haphazard. And if you brought perhaps some thought, some synergy into the process, and we looked at the value chain and other things like that, we could really make this into a viable, potentially sustainable industry. In a world in which the demand for fish was going up, the amount of what you might call on-land scientifically driven fishing capabilities were being developed, and really where the amount of production also and the amount of fishing was also increasing, and still you had an increasing demand to meet. And with a tourism industry in Trinidad and Tobago, even if you looked at Tobago alone as an island, I mean, fishing could be a pretty viable industry in a tourist island in which people are coming surrounded by water, and fish would be a delicacy and something to prize on the dinner table. So we had three very important contributions here. And I open the floor now to discussion and questions. And if I need any help, would you please help me? But we would like to open the floor for discussions and for questions from the floor. And I would ask the three presenters to keep in mind a couple of questions I will ask them to close on in the end when they sum up, which is, since we are focused on labor market realities, labor productivity really, and Forex earning potential, I wonder if Dr. Potts could address the issue of knowing the fishing industry as we know it now, as we know what we have and what is happening. What are the 2 or 3 things that we could do? One, to bring ourselves to self-sufficiency in fish production for food consumption at home, started with Tobago. Secondly, how we could affect the balance of trade in our favor in terms of fishing, export and production. Sorry, import versus export and production for local consumption. And thirdly, if there was one more enhancing thing that we could do to the existing industry, what would that be? These are questions I would ask Dr. Potts to think about as we close. Dr. Hussein, I would leave for last, but Dr. James, I wonder if some of the items that you mentioned as being right for foreign exchange earnings, if we got them right, if you could look at one or two of them and simply outline what are the few things that we would need to do in construction or reconstruction or redesign of these sectors in order to make them foreign exchange viable. And I would pick two, let's say one health and the other one education. We would leave tourism for a moment. And Professor Hussein, I would not ask him anything else. If he comes back into the picture, based on what Dr. James says and Dr. Potts says, if he would take it from there and look at the Trinidad and Tobago economy and talk about one or two things that we could do nationally, not just for the Tobago economy, that would make a difference. Now I noticed that Dr. Potts also, in talking about oil and gas, and especially gas in the Tobago vicinity, in the waters between Tobago and Trinidad, he talked about the challenge of the environment and the challenge of fishermen's interests and let's say energy interests. But the one of the big questions really is, how do you do it in a way that is fair to both Tobago and Trinidad, so that Tobago becomes a significant contributor to the national economy and basically weans itself out from dependence on the Trinidad government. So these are big questions that we will come to at the end. I ask the audience to please participate and make their contribution. Rebecca, help me, please. Huh?
Yes,
Yes, sure.
I'm here to help. I noticed Dr. Gonzalez has his hand up. Dr. Gonzalez, go ahead.
Chair. Yes. Good evening, Chair. I wanted to ask Professor James two small questions. First of all, I wasn't clear as to the competitive advantage of this country, Trinidad and Tobago. In some of the areas that you mentioned, you didn't really go into this question of competitiveness, and of course you didn't have the time, and I understand that. But I was not clear on what basis you would be able to export. Now I get the impression that you were saying that there's a capacity for innovation and there's a culture that allows you to innovate. I think some of that came from Bess when he spoke about import displacement and our ability to develop new products and stuff like that. But innovation is a very serious thing. It involves a lot of creativity. It involves a lot of knowledge. You have to produce a lot of knowledge, a lot of basic research if you're going into research and development. So it wasn't clear as to the basis on which you're going to export. The second item on which I wasn't too clear, why would foreign investment want to come to export in this country? What is in it for them? When we talk of foreign investment, we usually think of, well, there are gains for them insofar as they may be able to develop, let's say, in the particular market. That is to say, if the market is large enough. In our case, the market is not large enough and is not attractive to them. Or if there's a natural competitive advantage, as we have in oil and gas, they would come because they could benefit from the low price of gas and oil and so forth. So they would come there and export and make money. But what is in it for a model in which the human capital required to develop the exports you were talking about is something that the country seems to be producing itself. And is that what is, what I'm trying to understand is, I know, for example, like in Singapore, they attract foreign capital to come and develop new products. Insofar as research and development is involved, and Singapore has the capital that would assist foreign capital to develop these products in Singapore for export. I'm not understanding in our particular case what would be the attraction of foreign capital to come here and export. I'll stop there for the time being.
Okay. First, let's take education, and I'll leave healthcare and all those things. Let's talk about how an economy, any economy, anywhere in the world, collaborates with the world to produce an exportable education service. The best examples of that, of course, is what we have in Cambridge and Oxford and so on. The first thing you have to recognize is you have to invest to build comparative advantage. It's not natural. I mean, you have some natural, like in oil and gas, but when you're talking about intra-industry trade type activity, you have to invest to build it. And the investment doesn't have to be purely by locals or for local needs. So you have to set out a deliberate investment program to bring collaborative elements to be put up your share of the money. You look at what happened in Roosevelt Island in New York City, for example, where they had almost no, New York City, they had almost no Silicon Valley quality investments going in digital innovations. They went to Israel and brought Technion, they brought Cornell, and they put 150 million US dollars together and said, let's invest in creating a facility here in Roosevelt Island that can bring students from around the world to go to school here. It's something like that St. George's University tried to do and is trying to. You bring people into the environment on a collaborative basis. The government put up the space and other things like those. And we try to do it in many of the things we're trying to do in our industrial parks and so on. But manufacturing is not the space where we're going to build technical capability to do high quality production anytime soon. On the other hand, if you look in the education services, and you look at what we've been able to do with UWI, for example, I won't say UTT, but let's take UWI as our best example and look at what we're able to do with, say, our medical school. And you would see that if you entered into any collaboration, as you did when you were starting the university, with foreign institutions to grow capacity, then you could do better in a collaborative environment like that than you are, say, doing in St. George's, even though they're doing pretty well. So you have to know what you're going after and invest the resources to put the capabilities that are needed in place. Now, what they've done in, say, St. Augustine is to continue the old tradition of a teaching university. But suppose you put those resources to building research capability in one or two critical areas. Didn't have to be all of them, as we saw in the Mona Medical Program. Research can be added to the investment effort you're trying to make. So in other words, you could have, especially in the modern digital environment, you attract, you go after, I mean, let me just make this other side of it. I spent 6 months in the University of Manchester on a sabbatical. And I could tell you that what they were doing then is that they were saying, we're going after 20 Nobel Prize winners from around the world to bring them into the University of Manchester, to make us the best university in Britain. Trinidad and Tobago could have the same kind of perspective. We're going after 10 of the best professors in field A around the world. And we're putting up $50 million to bring them to work in our space and build capacity. Now, they'll make their income out of your 50 million, but the gain you are making is the capacity to produce products that could then attract other people to come in to exploit the innovations that you create. The point I'm really making is, you could see it easily in education in all the faculties you have, is that you have to invest in building the capacity you are going after to generate the surpluses that could, well, the innovations that could create the surpluses that foreigners would find attractive. You know, it's not like oil and gas where it's there in the ground, but it's not impossible for us to build it in an area like education and educational service delivery, or in knowledge development. The musicians are proving every year that they can do innovations on that basis without us putting any money. What happened if you invested in a clever way to underwrite what they're trying to do? So the whole point I'm making about education is, you have to invest to build up the capacity to generate the surpluses that would attract foreign investors to come in. It's not natural. It's not natural in Singapore. It's not natural in Britain. It's not natural in the US or anywhere else. As part of intra-industry trade, you have to create it by investing appropriately. That's the point, say, Paul Krugman was making. It matters what you are trying to do, not that you are trying to do things. So that's the way I would respond to the question about what would attract people. You have to create the attraction. It's not impossible. And you can't start by saying you can't do it. The possibilities you have in our countries is not in airplane manufacturing and so on, but you can do things in the creation of educational services for export. You can do things. There is a university in Trinidad and Tobago that was designed to produce education for export. That's the University of Southern Caribbean. And when we had in mind to create a university in Tobago, that was what we had in mind. Not to build something for the local market and for education of local students, but to produce education services for export. That's exactly what St. George's is doing, successful. And we could do the same and better in Trinidad and Tobago. And you start where you can and see what comes of the efforts to produce knowledge and produce products that can generate surplus out of the knowledge you produce. And that's how the whole world works. That's where you got cell phones from.
Dr. Tuari, you can unmute your mic.
I'm not.
We're here. We heard you just there for a second.
The mic muted.
Yes, it is. While, hi, Dr. Tuari, you're still muted.
All right, okay, I'm on now. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, you heard Dr. James's response. Is there another question or a retort or anything like that?
Well, if there are no other questions, I would just like to follow up on what Dr. James said. I think there have been a number of attempts to go down that route. That is to say, to follow Grenada. We have talked a lot here about a medical school here. In some of the other islands, I know Barbados, St. Kitts, and so forth, they have been trying that. So that is a possibility that I think quite a few of the islands have been exploring, following on the success of the Grenada school. Now, what I don't see there really in that model, however, is something going beyond the school itself. That is to say, I see a school where foreigners come to learn because it's cheaper for them to come there and learn and then go back to the United States. Beyond that, I'm not sure I'm seeing what you're talking about in terms of developing products and services which can then be exported. What I believe I'm suggesting here is that I think you need a lot more. You see, you can do that in the United States and so forth, where there's a sophisticated basic research program where lots of money are spent and there's a lot of experimentation and exploration. And it's a kind of hit and miss, you know, innovation, especially research and development, is based on probability. You may only probably get about 20 or 30% success. You might largely have 70% failure, but the 30% success would probably make up for the 70% failure. So I'm not seeing to what extent you can go very far beyond what is happening in Grenada, and to some extent, I think there's a school in Dominica as well too. I'm not seeing them being able to go beyond that in terms of the knowledge development that you're talking about. Now, I understand the point that you're making in relation, let's say, to probably steel ban. And I think
Exactly.
earlier, I think you're talking about steel ban was a cultural invention here with possibilities that if we had invested, put more engineers and stuff like that, which we tried to do later on, and you see some of it coming to fruition now and so on. I could understand some of that, but I'm not clear in my mind really how you do this with foreign investors, unless the foreign investor has some clear idea of a product or a service that they want to develop. As I say, when they go to Singapore, it is because there's a clear product that they're hoping to develop for the international market, and they want to use Singapore technicians and Singapore human capital in order to develop that product, because it's cheaper to use Singapore capital to develop that particular product. But they come there with a clear understanding that this is the product they want to develop, and it's cheaper to develop that in Singapore because Singapore has human capital at a lower price than they have in the United States. I think that's the basis on which I understand that. You know, but anyway, I mean, I understand the point you're making. I tend to think that there are several other bases for comparative advantage that we need to look at. It's not just the knowledge development part of it is part of it, and that is the innovation part. The other aspects that I think we have to look at, you know, things like location, things like culture and so forth, that you're not, which you could also develop comparative advantage. I think, for instance, that there are many areas which probably are sort of automatic in the sense that, let's say, tourism. Tourism is right throughout the region. We have a comparative advantage in tourism because of our proximity to the United States. And once our price is right, our wages are right, we can develop tourism in a very competitive way. Why this has been neglected in both islands, as far as I see it, because of the oil and gas. So you don't necessarily need much of a knowledge development yet to push a sector like that. That could be developed if we go after it in a certain way in terms of marketing and so on. But we don't have the time ready to have a more extensive discussion on that. So I leave it at that.
Let me just make a quick.
I agree that.
Let me just make a quick point to you on the education with respect to steel ban, for example. I think we're going down the same road, I think. Take steel ban. Take what we do with the Panorama. Every year, we bring, say, 6,000 foreigners to Trinidad and Tobago, especially to Trinidad, to practice and learn to play pan for free with all stars and despas and so on, because these people want to be able to play pan, and they would spend 6 weeks, 8 weeks. That tells you there is potential there. There's a market that you could build if you put money behind it and put the notion behind it that the steel bands are schools, which they become in Panama. That could be a locus of investment in which you could say, let me go to Indiana University or Berkeley in Boston and say, look, here's a real product we can collaborate to invest in building out. We have a natural environment and a set of events that will encourage people to come every year. And you could see a potential investment there that could make money. If you think of it as education for export, you're exporting it for free now. The other face of that, of course, is it doesn't just have to be that you're teaming up with people to produce the education service without the research component. You could take what you're doing in Steelman and you could tie it to the efforts we need in the carnival industries to produce post-carnival products, film and video and all of those kinds of things, with scores created by Steel Band and other kinds of music. And you could, if you had your share of the investment funds, go sit down with Disney and say, we have a real product here that could translate into a year-long, more attractive video games that are not violence-based, based on the beauty of the human body and so on. You know, it's not always obviously there. That's my point about intra-industry trade. You have to invest in the innovations required. And it's only as you do that, the possibilities open up before you. I'm not talking about education for export in the Rush University sense, more like what St. George's is doing, but even more so like what we could do with Steel Band or with research-driven medical schools that we could put money into and team up with the world. I remember in 1987, just to tell you this quickly, when we started talking about a second university in the country, we went to talk to Johns Hopkins and Rutgers and so on. And would you be interested if we could find our research funding and our counterpart funding in coming to help to build a serious second university in Trinidad and Tobago with the goal of producing exportable education services for foreign students? We could recruit from all over. And all into a university, they all said yes. Now you have to, of course, take your time, search. It's not magic. It's not going to happen just by wanting it. But that's the whole point of research and development and innovation and exploration and so on. And that's what we do in WIPO, going all over the world trying to encourage countries to join that agenda. Trinidad and Tobago could do it, and we have enough resources and people, resources and in the sense of money and people, to get started down that road. That's my whole point. Don't just keep your eyes focused only on educating the local market. You have to take baby steps at first if necessary, but step by step, you move away from simply thinking that education for the local market is what your fundamental design has to be. There's no obvious easy answer, but you could work out an answer. That's my point. That's how innovation is. The musicians prove that.
Yeah. Are we there?
Yes, Dr. Tawari, go ahead.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Is there
Yeah.
another from the
Yeah.
floor?
Hi, Dr. Tawari. Mr. Bob from the floor would like to ask a question. Mr. Bob, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I want to ask 3 questions. One to Dr. Hossain, one to Dr. James, and the other to Dr. Potts. Dr. Hossain mentioned in his introduction, and he was speaking about labor participation. And I think he made mention of the fact that labor participation in Tobago was, on a per capita basis, was higher than possibly in Trinidad. But the production, and he also said increase in labor production should bring increase in productivity. But he said in Tobago, although you had this increase in labor participation, productivity decreased. Now, I want to know whether labor participation there's some disconnect somewhere with respect to the Tobago situation, where labor participation in Tobago, what it really means as compared to, let us say, in Trinidad, why it produces this decreased production, that sort of thing. The second question is to Dr. James, and it has to do with the blue economy, because I think if we have to develop, we have to more or less develop our basic resource. And one of our basic resource is the blue economy. And to me, what seems self-evident is that the seas that surround the Caribbean can provide new opportunities for much needed growth and development. Now, we in the Caribbean, as I see it, command access to the widened Panama Canal, as we are the north, south, and east-west intersection for international shipping. Now, as such, doesn't this offer multiple opportunities for the creation of transshipment ports linked to the development zones in the Caribbean Rim countries for like manufacturing, for producing services like foreign language, legal services, financial services for nations like China and Brazil, countries which are seeking new tariff-free ways to access markets in North America and Europe? And to Dr. Potts, with respect to the marine environment, I'm saying. Now, I think our emphasis should be with wealth-creating skills in the marine services and so on. And I'm thinking, asking him whether he wouldn't think it's a good thing that we have to start with the curriculum, because as they say, teach a man, give a man a fish. It's better to teach a man to fish than to give him a fish. And whether it might not be a good thing to go into the curriculum, because we have the resources, the sea and so on, and introduce subjects like shipbuilding and navigation skills and so on, giving people certificates at the highest level, that the world can be their stage in using their skills. So I'm asking whether it might not be a good thing in terms of starting with education in building and developing wealth-creating skills, not the normal laborer skills, but the wealth-creating skills in both building and navigation skills and so on, that the people could use. The world is their stage in selling their skills. Those are the questions.
Dr. Tawari, there's one other person with their hand up, Mr. Lloyd Taylor. May I just ask him to unmute and ask so we can deal with all the questions in one round?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity presented by this forum here. I want to ask Dr. James for a fuller exposition of his point. That 2 points. One is that you can't move the development forward without having very clearly thought out policy shocks, what that means. And 2, without a lot of information informing the process of economic development. I would like to hear a fuller exposition of that. Those 2 points. For Dr. Potts, I noticed there was a relative absence of emphasis on fish processing. For example, things like cornfish, which might go some way to reducing the import bill. I would like him to speak to that as a possibility that we can incorporate quite seriously. I know we have done it in the past, we have made efforts, but we can consciously pursue it now and in the future. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Tawari, back to you. So I think the panel has a series of questions that they would have gotten from the audience as well as from you. You can unmute your mic. Hi, Dr. Tawari, your mic is still muted.
I can't.
Okay, there we go.
All right. I was saying that Lloyd Taylor asked a question to Dr. James. I don't know if he wants to address it, and also one to Dr. Potts. So they might address that. Are there other questions on the floor that we might take?
No other hands are raised and no other questions in the chat, Dr. Tawari.
Okay, well, I would ask Dr. if he wants to address it. I think Dr. Potts was also asked a question. You can address it. And while you do so, you can summarize and make your closing statements in the end.
The answer to both Lloyd Taylor and George Bob hangs on one critical thing. And in particular, that's the nature of the civilization building part of our being, or sociological being. That's the full scope, full spectrum part of us. This civilization building sector has an innovation, a capital producing innovation component. It has food production, fish production, blue economy extraction, red economy exploitation, and so on. So if you develop it, if you facilitate its development, you will get what George Bob wants, which is the exploration of the blue economy. And therefore, I would say to him, yeah, that's a big part of the effort to develop Tobago. But that's natural to the civilization building economy. We do agriculture, we do fisheries, we do clothing manufacturing, we make music, and most of all of these things we've naturally tried to export. And the music is the epitome of that. So facilitate its development, and you are on the way. It takes time, it takes continuous calibration and tinkering and so on. It's the point I'm making to Prof. Gonzalez, right? That in principle, it's not that you know what the answer will be tomorrow. You have to just keep allowing the thing to evolve and to develop, and you never know where you'll end. The way you facilitate its development is to answer the question really that Taylor is asking. And that goes to, if you look carefully at the data we've been able to assemble, and the model that we've been able to get to work to fit the time part of the economy, you would see an enormous degree of interdependence in it. And what you find in that setting is that it's difficult to know who to help, when to help them, how to help them, who should help them, and all of that sort of stuff. So you need full information decision making. You need everybody to be part of the dialogue. You need a Prof. Gonzalez's voice, you need a Botiwari's voice, you need a Lloyd Taylor, but you need information from all sorts of circles coming into a process in which we have a disciplined way to make a final decision and discipline the implementation agencies that are responsible, including agencies like your cabinet or your executive council and so on. In the absence of a full information system of that kind, you're likely to make mistakes all the time and be overcome by doubt that you can't get development tomorrow morning and therefore don't bother to do it, which is the attitude we've been having throughout my lifetime in this country. Ever since independence, that's we just think if you can't make the money next week, it look hard, don't bother. But if you set up a process that is full information driven, knowledge creation driven, and so on, as the civilization building part of our being is, then what you're going to get is a systematic process of decision making put in place that more than likely most of the time we'll get it right. Or at least, as Ralph said, Anthony said, enough times. You get it right 30% of the time, that's good enough for the development process. Anyway, that's how cell phones came about. I remember when I was a graduate student in the new school, they used to call what we call cell phones now bricks, and everybody used to say they could never develop into anything useful. And look where we are today. Little bit by little bit, as the science expands around you, you find ways to make progress. So I think that's the way we have to think about the thing. Develop that part, provide a mechanism through which strong decisions could be made about what we're doing that doesn't discriminate against our whole being, you know, or civilization building sense. And a little bit at a time, it may take 1,000 years, you'll make progress. Don't forget it took Britain 1,000 years to escape Roman colonization. That's how the world works. It's a continuous dynamic process, learning, moving from dark ages into lives of exploration. And our musicians have proven to us that every year you could come up with saleable, profitable innovations. And if you are clever enough, you could find ways to bring the whole world into the process. So I think that's a summary way to end my comments, answer Lloyd and answer George Bob at the same time.
Okay, and thank you for a wonderful contribution and engagement the evening. We go on to Dr. Potts. Would you respond to Lloyd Taylor, if you are so minded? And
Yes,
maybe
sir.
you can close off your part of this session this evening.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Tirari. Let me first treat with George. George asks whether we could treat with wealth creation skills in the marine sciences area. And he was talking specifically in us going to the curriculum. It is important to note that people in Tobago, and I guess we could also say by extension Trinidad, because most of the landing sites that I worked on in Trinidad, all the way in Moruga, with all these different agent, they call corporations or fishermen associations, they all have people in their household, their sons, their grandsons, nephews, and so on, who literally learn the fishing trade with their fathers, with their uncles. So the trade is literally handed down in a hands-on way to a lot of these people in the communities. So you may even find a fellow going to high school, get 5 or 6 O levels, get his degree at UWI or UTT or whatever, and you'll find that 10 or 15% of those guys who stay with their family and still go to sea, or especially in Tobago. You find a number of those guys still involved with the sea, or they may not get much time to go to sea, but they invest and still get their boats going. So they learn, I said all that to say they learn the trade literally hands-on. In terms of actual curriculum, the government set up the CFTDI a number of years ago, especially to train fisher folk in a number of the same skills that George mentioned. Safety at sea, troubleshooting, two-stroke engines that they normally go to sea with, net mending and repair, coastal navigation and general seamanship. There are a host of training sessions for which they get certification, and that CFTDI down at Chagaramas was specifically for that, for persons in general, starting from literally no qualification, certification, that is, no certification all the way to people who they have degrees that want to go to those programs. So it is there, but I think it has kind of waned off, and George does have a point. And I was talking to a couple of people just recently, and we need to start to look at it again. And we need to ensure that in a place like Tobago, if not the Department of Marine Resources and Fisheries, need to take that on very seriously, along with the Fisheries Division in Trinidad, to recognize that lots more could be done to train the persons involved in the fishery, because it came out very clearly from the lack of data being kept in terms of record keeping, when they buy the boat, when they bought the engine, when they sold it, how much fish they caught this month, how much money they make. Lots of them literally use the memory to do that. So it's very clear that at least record keeping along with all the others need to be taught again, and some kind of formal situation need to be set up. And that may be one of the recommendations that we will put in. And very soon when we have our report to the public, you'll recognize that more than just the general curriculum will be preferred as a way to treat with this particular one. So it's a good one, George. Thank you very much. I think it really makes sense. We need to teach people literally how to fish so that they don't necessarily will depend on other people, and more than that, put them out there where they could be involved in regional and international places to do the skills. Additionally, I want to recognize that UTT's maritime unit, separated apart from the marine sciences unit, which deals with marine living resources, seagrass beds, fisheries, and mangroves, and so on. There's a maritime that deals with people trained in shipbuilding, ship repairs, and engine maintenance and management commercially, and so on. So that kind of service does exist down at the UTT, where some people can literally, after learning at the lower level, they can come and do diploma and certificates and still look for jobs on the coastal steamers and on ships that carry large cargo regionally and internationally, and so on. So we do have that capacity already to some extent, but as George said, maybe we need to have it more exposed to the youngsters and let them know that that wealth of things is available, plus we can do some more. So thank you very much for that. And Lloyd, I haven't seen or heard from Lloyd or George in a long time. Kristen, gentlemen, good night. Lloyd asks about the absence of processing. You recognize a very important thing. There was a time in Tobago had 10 serious processors, enough to really satisfy that. That was a big thing in the 80s and 90s in Tobago. People like Emmy Louis, who was I think is an engineer or architect or somebody, civil engineer. He actually owned a fish processing plant and owned boats, and had people going to sea, and he was doing a really good job. Roy Jacob, fish processor, still in Tobago functioning. Claudette Nero was doing it until the government took away the lands in Crown Point, where she had a home and her processing plant. So that processing plant was literally demolished for the airport expansion. Hopefully she'll build a new one in the new place she has gone to. We've lost McCool in Scarborough when he died. I think his sons, they continue going to sea, but they didn't continue with the fish processing. And particularly with that salting and corn fish thing, that is a real Trinidad and Tobago country thing that make a lot of sense. And fish like bonito and others that normally don't make the fresh fish consumption list as easily. When that is corned and smoked, it turns out to be a real great delicacy, just like the saltfish has been and is now in Trinidad and Tobago. And so, Lloyd, you're literally onto something good there. We have flagged that as an important area to encourage to regrow and to rebuild, because right now we could literally say that there's about 2 or 3 really serious fish processors on the island, and we need to get back up to that number, which will be one of the things to answer one of the questions later on. As I move on, Dr. Tirari did challenge me to look at 3 areas as I close off. He asked, how can we manage ourselves, right? To self-sufficiency in fish, starting with Tobago. Tobago has people who have gone to sea literally since the end of enslavement. And lots of families from Crown Point to Charlottesville, they've continued in the vein of their parents and their grandparents going to sea, and they're really skilled fisher folk. The thing though is that we need to have a more dedicated bunch of people doing that job, but they need support in terms of marketing of their fish. They need to know that there's a market for their fish. So therefore, work need to be done, even from maybe one or two of them to get involved and set up some kind of a processing plant or other processing plants that would be in a position to stand strong when large quantum of fish is brought ashore. Because one of the problems in Tobago, when people bring fish ashore and they are sold at the fish site, landing sites, or one or two people drive through the village and sell what they sell, and the small amount go to the hotels and the restaurants. Sometimes the price is a price glut. Even one time, kingfish was going for $5 a pound a year or two in Palatuvia because there was no market for it. So there is clearly need for market development and the ability for us, at least statewide, to be able to encourage and ensure that the cold chain thing is maintained from the time fish is caught, and that the whole sanitation, fish, food sanitation thing is maintained. No wading of fish through coastal waters in open baskets to contaminate them, but that they put on some ice and brought literally on a landing pier and wheelbarrowed to a coastal storage where they can maintain the 4 degrees thing and so on, so that fish can be properly processed, vacuum sealed, packaged, and made available to marketing and so on. That sort of thing is what is required to ensure that that whole issue of self-sufficiency could happen. Because I think fish, large amounts of fish are being caught, and more could be caught. Even with the challenge now in terms of some people having to go further and so on, and maybe stay longer, but enough fish is still being caught. So I think that's how we could probably deal with that. And at the same time, we can answer that question about increasing export to improve the balance of trade in fish. If we have that marketing properly set up, we ISO 9000 things for Europe, and the EU market is up to scratch. And of course, it has some standards for North America, Canada, and USA. If those things are in place, of course, we'll be able to access more of those markets. And of course, we have to have the airlift. Maybe Caribbean Airlines have to have a dedicated approach to taking our fish outside there, because that has been a challenge in the past when a number of the processors were doing good work. There was an airlift problem in moving the fish from Trinidad and Tobago to the North American market. So once we could improve on those areas, things can happen. And your last thing you asked, Doc, was what one or two things can we probably do to make this a decisive difference in the organization of the fishing industry to make it more sustainable? One of the things I noticed in Tobago and in Trinidad is that we have fishermen associations. And these fishermen associations form themselves so as to advocate for the best interest of the fishermen. And a lot of time they spend more time fighting for compensation. I see it on the news a lot this week, and issues to do with Barbados encroaching and all those sorts of things. But somehow we need to help strengthen those and make sure that whatever the government agencies, the Department of Marine Resources and Fisheries, the division in Trinidad, the institutions that are involved that assist in different aspects of the whole fishing industry, we have to work together. There needs some kind of coming together and ensuring that there's a collaboration towards improving the whole industry. And if we do that, then work will also be done easily by the Institute of Marine Affairs, the Department of Marine Resources and Fisheries in Tobago, the UE fisheries people, the UTT fisheries people with research. All those people come in, and of course we have the EMA with their responsibilities. If we have collaborative approach, there was a time when they had the Monitoring and Advisory Committee for local fishing, and that was chaired by the Director of Fisheries in the Ministry of Agriculture, and it worked very well. That has since been dismantled, and there was also a Monitoring and Advisory Committee for foreign fishing and related matters, and that was a very useful committee that assisted us when we dealt with the delimitation matters, because I was on the delimitation team that treated delimiting Barbados from Trinidad and Tobago maritime-wise, and also Grenada. We still have St. Vincent and the Grenadines to delimit with Trinidad and Tobago. But those monitoring advisory committees that had agencies like the Coast Guard and Customs and Excise and the military. All those people were involved in that committee met once a month and reported to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries. And a lot of good work was done there. So maybe some of that collaborative work is required because we're talking sustainability of the stock. And we know a number of stock, according to the researchers, are threatened, endangered, close to being overexploited and so on. So we'd have all these people coming into play and providing the kind of intellectual scholarship and support that is required to ensure that our very important industry is sustained. Did I forget anything? I don't know.
No.
All right, so thank you very much. Yeah.
I want to thank you for your contribution this evening. Very comprehensive, very interesting, I thought, very insightful, and for your concluding remarks and your response to the questioners. I want to do the thing to Dr. James. I don't suspect that Professor Hussain is online with us, right?
No, Dr. Tiwari, he wasn't able to get back on.
Right. Okay. So we want to apologize for him, but also to thank him for his very precise but still in contribution tonight in kind of framing the issues of tradable versus non-tradables and the quality of the labor market participation and the linkage between that and foreign exchange earnings, not just for Tobago, but for Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to thank the presenters as a whole and the people who asked questions for focusing on a very important issue at a relatively micro level, given that we are talking about Tobago in relation to the national economy. But remember that Tobago is really not only the smaller island in the major relationship between the bigger island, Trinidad and Tobago, but really half of Trinidad and Tobago in many ways. Not really dwelling on the numbers or the size of the island, but dwelling on the cultural and socio-economic relations between Tobago and Trinidad as a multi-island economy. And we must not forget that besides Tobago and Trinidad, Trinidad and Tobago is a country in which there are many, many islands. There are 5 of them right off the coast of Chaguaramas, and there are others off the coast of Tobago. But all of these...
Total. 23 in
Sorry?
total. 23 islands.
23 in all. And,
23 in all.
And they constitute, what we are as a nation state. And as you know, islands have a significant impact on the whole business of land space and sea space, and which are becoming very important things. So we must be aware of that. But these were still in contributions tonight, and we had some good questions. I must thank Professor Gonzalez who asked, and the other questioners who asked, Lloyd Taylor, and I forgot a third person asked very, very good, pointed questions, knowledgeable questions. And I thank you all for participating. I thank Rebecca for anchoring the entire program this evening, Rebecca Gookool. And I thank Mark Rupchan for putting things in place to make the Zoom arrangements possible and have it so flawless. So good night to all of you. Thank you very much. And we'll see you again for another session under the Trade and Development Unit of Trade and Development Unit of the University of the West Indies. And we will talk